As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. Today we have a very special guest with us, Mike Rivero. He is a journalist, founder, and host of WhatReallyHappened.com. Formerly, he was working in the LA area until he was blacklisted there for asking some difficult and inconvenient questions about a shocking incident. He'll tell us more about that in a moment. And we're here to talk with Mike today about how people can discern what the real story, the truth is behind the news. A lot of our listeners are concerned about the well-being of their family, about their financial security, about their liberty, their privacy, and they have, for good reason, become concerned that they're not getting the whole story from mainstream media or from official government sources. Mike Rivero has made a career of exposing some of the deception and truth gap between what the official story is and what's really happening. Mike's here to talk with us about real and present dangers that are affecting ordinary people, even though they're not being told about it. Mike, welcome to our show.
Well, thank you for having me today.
I wonder if you could give people just a brief understanding of some of your credits in the entertainment industry before you started your journalism career, so they understand where you came from and that you have played a major role in some major productions.
Well, I would like to add that before I was in the film industry, I worked for NASA in imaging science. My first ambition in life was to be an astronomer, but I got caught in the post-Apollo cutbacks, and I'd had a brief career as a child actor, and I was talked out of pursuing a further career in Hollywood by my parents, as so many are, and I went high technology, and I did very well there, and then there was this huge aerospace depression in Los Angeles, and I was out of work, and a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend who knew about my strange dual background of having been a child actor and knowing all about this new thing called the microcomputer sent me over to this little cinder block, hole-in-the-wall place in Van Nuys called Industrial Light and Magic, and it was a classic case of being in the right place at the right time. And it took off, and it went from there into the film industry. But I do have a science and technology background that I do rely on quite a bit in terms of my writings and my talk radio show.
And your involvement then in the film industry before you were essentially ushered out of that and were able to start your own media career were in what kind of capacities?
Visual effects and computer animation. I was one of the first people to get into computer animation development with a company called Robert Abel and Associates, and they went out of business, and I'd spent some time with Hanna-Barbera before that, and after that just bopped around a lot of productions. I worked on Star Trek The Motion Picture, The Day After Tomorrow. I was a visual effects supervisor for 4 seasons of Lost, and it was a lot of fun. You know, I was working in the film and television industry, and quite by accident stumbled across evidence that the official story in the death of White House Deputy Counsel Vincent Foster was not the suicide, and I did the proper thing as a citizen, see something, say something, and the instant I did, my career evaporated, and I was blacklisted, and we lived in Washington State for a couple of years just to get away from all the harassment and death threats, and then I got hired by a Japanese film company to come to Hawaii, and they didn't care that the White House hated my guts, and I did get my film career back for a time, but a few years ago while I was working on a TV series, Off the Map, I just realized I couldn't carry the workload of both any longer, and I had to make a choice. So I just decided that I really needed to focus on trying to derail this hideous rush to war. By choice, I am now out of the film and television industry.
Now, in your involvement with the entertainment industry, you certainly have a real-time experience with people presenting sort of artificial realities as convincing as they can be presented, and it turns out that reality is like that, and you've got some examples to share with us today about things that people are being told are happening that really aren't happening, or things that they're not being told about that they must be aware of to really keep themselves and their families safe. A lot of our listeners have a reasonable, skeptical solid-headed approach to life, and they don't want to jump off the cliff at every conspiracy theory. But if you could start walking us through what you would consider the top concerns that are really threats to people's liberty, financial well-being, and privacy that people are not being told are actually happening right now.
Well, it is a very long and complex issue, and I don't want to overwhelm the audience all at once, which is certainly possible when you start dealing with the scale of what's really been going on. There is no question my work in visual effects was a major contributor not only to my expertise on my website. It was key to the incident with Vince Foster, which got me blacklisted out of Hollywood and sort of inadvertently started my career as a truth activist because it was my job to know what makes things look real and what doesn't. And thankfully for our side, most of the people doing these fakes for the government are not really very good at what they do. A couple of recent examples will be after the raid in Abbottabad, where Obama claimed they got Osama bin Laden. The internet was being flooded with all these fake photos to make it look like they'd really gotten bin Laden. Every one of them was a fraud. Every one of them was obviously a fraud. One of the more recent ones, there's this image circulating around that claims to be a satellite image showing the actual shoot down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 over Donetsk. And a lot of people bought into that one. But again, going back to my experience both with NASA and with visual effects, it didn't take very long to take it apart. And that, too, is a fake. And I think it was planted on the Russians to try and discredit them. There's a lot of false flag propaganda being poured onto the independent media right now because the corporate media has really lost the audience, and they've lost control of the minds of America. 2 Mondays ago, CNN had a 23-year record low of just 181,000 viewers out of a nation of 330 million people, and that is really a bad sign. Now, the corporate media can't win back the trust of the American people by continuing the pattern of lies and deception. So they've embarked on a campaign of trying to discredit the independent media by putting out a lot of nonsense, hoping people will buy into it so that the corporate media can say, oh, look at those silly independent bloggers. They actually believe that, you know, the Apollo moon landings were faked or that there was no plane at the Pentagon and so forth and so on. So it really is a propaganda war. It's a war for the minds of America. Right now, Washington, D.C., and Wall Street are clearly losing it, and we're beginning to sense a degree of panic in the halls of power and the halls of the money junkies. Some of the issues we're looking at today, of course, is the president certainly exceeding his constitutional authority with his pending executive order on immigration amnesty. We're waiting to see if Congress will have the spine to stand up and fulfill their role under the Constitution of holding the executive branch in check. And it's important for people to understand the reason it's called the executive branch is its legal role is to execute the will of the Congress, which in turn is supposed to be representing the will of the American people. And certainly over the last 10 years, we have come to discover through Edward Snowden's revelations that the federal government has just decided they are under no obligation to comply with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And in fact, one of the alarming things that has come out of the Common Core school curriculum is they're teaching young school children now that the Bill of Rights is actually a list of privileges the government gives you when they feel you're behaving rightly and can easily take away in times of national emergency. Now, that is absolutely not what the Bill of Rights is. The Bill of Rights are the things the government may not trespass on ever and still remain the legitimate government. So they're trying to really recraft the structure of the nation. They're trying to brainwash our young people into just blind obedience to authority. We saw exactly the same pattern in the Soviet Union under Stalin. We certainly saw the same pattern of indoctrination of the youth under the Nazis in Germany, and it's really very troubling to see it happening here.
Now, for people who wonder how that affects their daily life, certainly you mentioned Common Core and the curriculum that their children are going to be subjected to. I was listening to a radio presentation earlier today saying that the average school child goes through 13,000 hours of classroom time from kindergarten through 12th grade. And in a professional sphere, they often talk about how it takes 10,000 hours to really become a subject matter expert and really master a given discipline if you're really going to take it on. And so what we're saying is that our school children are going to be thoroughly and completely trained into whatever school of thought is going to be presented during their school career, and your point is that that's coming from a unfaithful constitutional standpoint going forward, and people need to be aware of that. That's a good example of where if they're going to make decisions as a family of how to make sure that their children are properly educated in what their constitutional rights and liberties are, that they need to look into it and take responsibility as a family to make sure that they're not unwittingly assuming that all is well in what their children are going to be taught.
Absolutely. Well, there's been a lot of stories about how parents who wanted to look at the Common Core curriculum were not allowed to. It was just very secret. It's us and the kids, and the parents have nothing to do with it. One of the most egregious examples of propaganda in the Common Core was in talking about the Bill of Rights, where the Second Amendment as presented that you have a right to keep and bear arms if you are in a state militia, which is, of course, not what the Second Amendment actually says. One of the more alarming developments is the way that children are being taught to handle basic math problems, and it's very convoluted, it's very difficult. It takes far longer to solve a problem with these methods than with the methods that you and I were raised with. And there's actually a statement that came out of one of the Common Core architects that the goal of Common Core was to basically eliminate the privilege of certain classes of people who had access to better education at home. They want to simply bring everybody down to the same level. And there's nothing new with that agenda. Many years ago, like 30 years ago, when I was still just barely out of college, I actually spent a year teaching remedial math at the high school level in California. And even back then, they were saying, don't spend time on the bright students. Your goal is to make sure everybody has the minimum education because that's what's politically acceptable. And it was very frustrating. It's one of the reasons why I decided not to pursue a career in teaching at that level. I've taught at the university level since then. But it really is all about they're trying to well, here, let me tell you what the process is going on. When we are very young, we are indoctrinated with a certain set of core beliefs, whether it's from our church or from our school. And this is at a time when children are so young, they don't really understand that the big people can be lying to them. And as you grow into adulthood, your personality forms around those core beliefs, and you eventually come to see yourself as that which is believed in. People will say, I am a Republican. They don't say, I support the Republican Party. They say, I am a Republican. I am a Democrat. I am a Christian. I am whatever. Their identity is the thing being believed in. And that is why these beliefs are so powerful in constraining your thoughts to a certain direction. And that is why Common Core is going into the schools at our youngest children possible and giving them a set of beliefs that will be useful for the future government to guarantee their obedience to authority, their absolute ignorance of what their true constitutional rights are supposed to be that so many earlier generations fought and died to defend. And it is a matchup exactly to the kind of indoctrination we saw under Stalin and under Hitler, and it goes all the way back to that Prussian model of public schooling, which was set up not to guarantee a public education, but to make sure that children in Prussia grew up prepared to join the military and march off and conquer other people's wealth.
Yeah, and that's a good example where people who are adverse, the title of our site, Reluctant Preppers, a lot of people are adverse to feeling that they don't want to be reactionary, they don't want to be leaping to conclusions, and they're really put off by people making sort of what they consider wild or sweeping generalizations, like saying, oh, we're like Stalin Russia, we're like Nazi Germany. But frankly, to slow it down and to actually lay out step by step how the formation of our school structure and school system of public education was modeled in many ways after the Prussian model, which, by the way, was also the model for Nazi Germany, really does kind of bring that sobering reality to home. And you can only deny it until you actually investigate it and find out that in fact that is the basis. And for people who are looking for a healthy alternative to that, I would encourage them to consider the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, hslda.org. They stand up in all 50 states for the rights of parents who are the natural and first educators of their children, and who have the option of delegating that responsibility to others if they so choose, but certainly have the right to continue as the primary educators of their children. Moving on beyond schooling, what would be another clear and present danger that you see lurking in today's reality that people are not being told about or being told falsehoods about that they should be aware of?
Well, on the 10th anniversary of 9/11, I was invited to New York, which is great because how often do peace activists get to perform off Broadway? And the core of my presentation, I didn't spend a lot of time on 9/11 itself. I basically went back and looked at all the numerous cases of deceptions by the U.S. government against the American people. The claim that there was a Spanish mine in Havana Harbor that sank the USS Maine, that of course was disproven. The claim that the Lusitania was not carrying weapons of war when it was sunk, that has since been disproven. Torpedoes in the Gulf of Tonkin, and on and on. And the point of my presentation was that when you look at the indications of deception and fraud in 9/11, it shouldn't be viewed as some kind of an aberrant, unique incident in American history. It really is business as usual. And the thing that I've certainly learned through more than 20 years of doing this kind of research is that we are lied to constantly by the government and the corporate media. We've now got Jonathan Gruber, who's out there on videotape, admitting they were lying to the American people to get Obamacare passed. That's just what they think their natural right and authority is to do what they want to do. And again, that's also not in the Constitution. So the first thing that people need to understand is, yes, the government and the corporate media will lie to you all the time. And I think following the revelation that Iraq did not, in fact, have nuclear weapons was definitely a watershed moment, because the natural inclination for most people is to just go along believing what the government and the corporate media tell you, because we're actually trapped a little bit by our own self-image. We're raised to think that we are moral, just, courageous people, that, like the movie heroes that we see on TV, we'd take a stand against injustice if we saw it. But when you're actually confronted with evidence that your government is engaged in war crimes, lies, deceptions, corruption, most people don't want to look at it, because then they face the choice, what am I going to do about it? And if they know the government is engaged in wrongdoing and they choose not to do something about it, then they have to surrender that part of their self-image that they're a good, moral, and just person. A lot of people don't even want to face that question, so they'll gratefully accept any propaganda handed to them by the government that lets them go on thinking, I'm a just, moral person, I would take a stand against injustice and crime. I just don't see a reason to do so right now. And it's for that reason that most propaganda really is not designed to survive careful analysis. Most propaganda is out there just to give the people who don't want to think about what's going on a reason not to. And once people become skeptical, once they lose their trust and faith in the government and the corporate media, and they start looking at the actual official stories, it very quickly begins to fall apart. Now, when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, of course, they had the whole magic bullet zigzagging and everything. It still took about 30 years to reach the point where half of Americans were willing to acknowledge the Warren Report was a cover-up. In the age of the Internet, of course, these things happen a lot faster. The Iraq War wasn't, the second Iraq War wasn't even over before everybody understood that had been started with a lie. And these days, because of independent media like you and I, the life expectancy of government lies can be clocked with an egg timer. And the phony dead Osama pictures and the bogus Flight 17 image are a good example of that. These things had barely made the corporate media when they were already being trashed all over the Internet.